"You're not even half the woman my mother is," Valerie said. The spoon in my hand stopped on its way to my mouth. For a long beat, the only sound in the room was the kitchen clock, small, steady, absurdly loud against the soft clink of crystal. Valerie's dress flashed red under the dining room light. Robert sat beside her, his shoulders a fraction too close to hers, looking at me like someone who had forgotten how to breathe. I smiled. I know that sounds strange. People expect heat, a defensive retort, maybe a teary flop into old habits. They expect the kind of scene you see in movies, the door slamming, the dramatic exit. I'd rehearsed an exit 1,000 times in my head. I'd imagined leaving the china, walking down the porch steps with nothing but my purse and my pride. But the smile I gave that night was neither silly nor small. It was a tight, careful thing, a seam stitched along a wound. It was the first stitch I allowed myself after 6 months of unraveling. You should know who I am. I'm Shirley. I'm 70. I was a seamstress for 48 years. My hands know patterns the way other people know their names. I could make a dress out of a grocery bag if someone needed it and have it look like it belonged in a window. I learned early how to patch things, not because I enjoyed being frugal, but because my father taught me that nothing worth having should be thrown away while it can be mended. I learned how to make do after Charles died, and then again when Robert had children, and then when the job market turned and rents kept climbing like stubborn weeds. On the table that night was the pudding I'd made from the last of the cream, set out in small crystal dishes I'd saved for company. There were plates that had survived decades of dinners, a folded linen my mother had embroidered with blue thread, and a candle I'd lit because the weather had gone gray, and I thought the light might do more than warm the room. They all looked ordinary, too ordinary for what was about to happen. Valerie sat across from me in heels that made everyone's eyes travel down her legs instead of into her face. She liked being seen. She liked the soft buzz of attention around her like a perfume. I've watched that sway before, how some people carry a room like it was theirs to command. Robert married her when he was 30. He was soft where I was hard, perhaps because Charles and I had tried to soften everything for him and left him with a tendency to cling where he should have stood. For years he tried. He truly did. But life makes patterns, and sometimes a pattern is wearing a groove into a person rather than a path out. Before dinner, I'd been humming as I set the table. The radio played some old song that made my knuckles ache with memory. I had a habit. I set things just so because it gave me control over the small corners of my life. Control is a funny thing when most of the big ones slip away. The first time I told myself, just this once, was in January. It was bitter outdoors, the kind of cold that makes your breath come out in little white prayers. Robert had called and sounded thinner than usual, voice like a coat hung out to dry. Valerie's job had moved elsewhere, and their landlord had given them a deadline that was closer than any safety net. They needed rent. I counted my pennies like a miserly lamb and found enough to help. It was a loan, I told myself. It was a Christmas miracle. I rationalized the first month away, because mothers always do. It is the language we know. Then the second month came, and the third. Months slipped into a pattern. I would take something small from the things I'd set aside for myself, an afternoon's pay from mending coats, the price of a navy button I could do without, and I would send it in an envelope. I wrote rent on the memo line in my head, though the checks said nothing. No one needed to know. I told no one, not even my sister Marge. There is a certain dignity in private sacrifice, and for a while I held on to that dignity like a warm shawl. There were nights I sewed until my eyes blurred, the little needle prickling like tiny accusations. There were mornings I warmed soup instead of coffee. There were afternoons when I said no to appointments I'd wanted, postponed cataract checks I could afford, but chose to defer because the math always ended the same. They needed more. I sold a few things. Small things at first. A sterling spoon set my mother had given me that I'd never used, a nightstand Charles had carved his initials into. People don't usually notice the absence of nightstands until you point it out. Then, in late spring, I did the one thing I never imagined I would do. I took Charles's wedding band to a jeweler and watched them appraise it. I walked home with the envelope folded like a secret. It paid 2 months' rent. I told myself stories so I could sleep. I told myself I was buying Robert time, a thin, precious currency. Time, I learned, is a delicate thing. It buys you the chance of change, but it will not force change into someone's hands. The truth is, none of that, the sewing, the sold ring, the small, steady thefts from my own quiet comfort, was meant to become a weapon to shame me. I kept it hidden, because shame is a private winter you do not invite guests into. I hid it because I wanted to protect them from the knowledge of my decline. I hid it because I believed, stubbornly and perhaps foolishly, that a mother's love is measured by what she is willing to carry alone. So when Valerie's words hit the room, the rest of the world froze. I could see the imprint of her statement, how neatly she'd aimed it, how she must have measured it against the image of her own mother like some invisible yardstick. "You're not even half the woman my mother is." It dripped with condescension. It had the kind of cruelty that is polished and handed over with a smile. I smiled back. It felt like the last polite thing on my list. And then, because my hands live in the business of making and mending, I reached, not for my fork, but for the small box on the sideboard, the one my mother had given me when I moved into the house years ago. It contained the few things I'd been carrying, receipts, pale letters from Robert when he was a boy, and the last envelope from the pawnbroker. The room held its breath. I opened the box. I laid out 3 envelopes on the table, face up. The handwriting on each was mine, slightly shaky toward the end, but clear. In round, deliberate numbers, the top one read $1,000. The second had another $1,000. The third had one more. The paper trembled a little under my fingers, but my voice didn't. "I paid your rent," I said to Valerie and Robert. I pointed to the envelopes as if they could agree with me on the truth. Valerie laughed. It was high and quick. "What are you talking about, Shirley? You can't just—" Robert went pale. His fork clattered against his plate. For a split second, he looked older than he had to be, like someone had skinned the last layer of his confidence off and left him raw. I watched him realize the implications in a slow, awful slide. "You paid it?" Robert said. The question had more sorrow than surprise. He looked at me like he'd been found out in a childhood dare. "Yes," I said. "For 6 months." The room reacted the way rooms do when a truth breaks through the wallpaper of polite life. Valerie's smile dried. She straightened her back as if she were bracing for a storm she imagined would fall elsewhere. The candle between us made little shadows on her neck. "You shouldn't have," she said, the sentence soft but edged. "We would have managed." I could have told her in that moment all the ways manage had become a shrinking room for them. I could have pointed to the unpaid notices Robert had shoved under the spare towel, the messages I'd found when I was looking for a lost button, messages with more pleading than plan. I could have listed the nights I'd sat at the edge of my bed and calculated how long my savings could hold the line. But I didn't. I gave one more slow smile that was meant to disarm, and then turned the paper so they could read what was written on the back. On the back of the envelope, in a smaller script, I'd written a note. "This stops in 30 days." Valerie's laugh turned into a sound like a snapped ribbon. "What? You can't—" She looked at Robert with that spear of accusation people use to blame without having to plan anything better. "What made you think you had the right?" she demanded. "Who are you to decide our lives for us?" I felt the old hurt, the familiar coil of shame that made me small. It rose like bile, but then something else took over, something steady and hot and honest. I thought of the nights I'd gone without because they needed more time. I remembered the bright, almost physical needle of humiliation when I learned they were spending on things that weren't necessary, the way a thread can slide from a seam and take the dress with it. I thought of the look on my son's face when he avoided my eyes the day a creditor came to the door. And that thought, seeing him shrink as the world closed around him, gave me a kind of mercy that had nothing to do with enabling and everything to do with love. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't get to decide what you do. I could have said no in the beginning, but I will say it now. I won't pay your rent after 30 days. Robert's face became a study in slow realization. For all his softness, he is stubbornly practical. You can see it in the way he arranges his lawn, the way he always sweeps the garage clean before winter. He looked like a man holding onto a net that was loosed. It's disorienting to have the safety line you've been stepping on removed and to find the gap before you know how far you will fall." "You can't do that," Valerie said, sharp and urgent. "Think about what you're doing." I thought about it. I thought about every stitch I'd made to hold our family together since Charles had passed, every dinner I'd smoothed, every little repair that meant someone else could save face. I thought about the days I'd sat at my machine praying that something would turn. They say a mother prays with her hands as much as her lips, and how those prayers sometimes felt like pleading with a blank wall. There is a difference between supporting someone and becoming the means by which their avoidance continues. Love should not be a ladder that grows only on one side. 30 days, I repeated. After that, it's not my responsibility. You'll have to find a way or face the consequences. Maybe that's what you need. Valerie's mouth opened and closed like a bird's. "You don't mean that. You're saying this because you're hurt." "You said something meant to wound," I said. "I'm not saying I'm not hurt. I am. But I'm saying I won't be reduced to a doormat for anyone's pride." "Reduced?" she scoffed. "You think you're being noble? This is about attention, about guilt." I let that land. I let her think what she wanted. People often accuse others of seeking attention when their own discomfort makes them blind. I used to go hungry before I let Robert or a neighbor want for bread. That was my way. It isn't something I would recommend for everyone. I'm not writing a manual here. I'm telling you what was true for me. I loved in the only ways I knew. Robert's voice was small. "Mom, we can work this out. We'll find a way." There was a tremor, an honest, trembling thing. He sounded suddenly like the man who'd changed his son's diapers and soothed fevers, like the boy who once wanted to build castles with me in the living room. Love can do that. It can shrink and swell. It can be shameful and brave in a single breath. "You need to," I said, "and I will help you figure out how in these 30 days. I will not make your future someone else's responsibility forever." "You sell the ring," Valerie said, revisiting the cruel thrust with the dullness of someone who doesn't know what it means to lose what you loved. "You pawned a memory." I felt a hot press in my throat. The ring had every dent Charles had. It smelled faintly of his skin. It was a betrayal of memory, and we had done what needed to be done. "I sold it so my son wouldn't sleep on an empty stomach," I said. "That's what I did." Valerie's eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't have let them use you like that." There it was, the old narrative. You should not be used. Yes, but there is a difference between being used and choosing to carry. My choice that night was to create a boundary, not to punish. The boundary was an act of love designed to teach that consequences shape change. I could see the calculations spinning in Robert's mind. The gratitude that had once sat like a warm shawl around him was tangled now with shame and anger at itself. Being helped by your mother is a strange wound. It hurts the ego where the heart used to be. "You've been telling me I'm not strong enough to help myself," Valerie said, softer now, coaxing. "You've been telling Robert he's not capable." She tried to fashion a kind of moral outrage that might slide the blame from her hands. I took a drink of water to steady myself. My hands are older and less steady than they used to be. I felt the pulse in my wrist, solid, absurdly present. When your body remembers a lifetime of mending, it keeps track of small things. It keeps track of kindnesses and sacrifices and debts you never write down. I didn't tell anyone they weren't capable, I said. I either believed in you enough to help or I didn't, but I will not continue to pay for a life that refuses to meet its own consequences. That phrase, consequences, hung there like a new piece of furniture in the room. In one corner, Valerie fluffed her indignation into a cushion to sit on. In the other, Robert felt the weather close in. The living room light made long shadows across the table. "You can't be serious," Valerie whispered. "You'll force us into homelessness." Her voice cracked with the kind of fear that becomes performance. Fear is a powerful show when you need an audience. "Maybe so," I said. "Maybe that is the point." My voice was not cruel. It was not theatrical. It was the same voice I'd used to comfort Robert when he scraped his knee as a boy. It is remarkable how those same syllables can do different jobs at different ages. After that, the conversation loosened into accusations that darted back and forth like small, frightened fish startling under a net. Valerie accused me of interfering. I accused her of swallowing dignity with a fork. Robert accused us both of being unreasonable. For every sentence Valerie tossed like a hand grenade, I had a memory ready to diffuse it. Nights I folded shirts at the kitchen table until dawn. The muffled sobs I swallowed alone. The hours I tuned the radio low so the house would not hear my worrying. I let the memories stand like evidence on the table between us. They had a quiet truth that struck harder than any shouting. At one point, Robert stood up and began to pace. He said something about finding work, about trying harder. I believed him with the same soft faith I always had. But belief does not always make a job appear. I could see in his face the strain of a man who had been kept afloat too long and was now expected to swim without a buoy. "You'll find something," I said. "We'll look together in the next 30 days. I'll help with applications. I'll sit with you and edit a resume. I can't fix this for you forever. I won't." Valerie's jaw worked. She looked at him like he was a stranger deciding whether to stay in a sinking boat because someone else was bailing. That look cut me in a way that made me think of the days when married couples look at one another over bills and wonder if the love they had was enough to hold the roof up. And then, when the tempers had cooled to a simmer and the room felt raw with the truth I'd thrown open, a small sound came from my pocket. My phone, ancient and familiar, vibrated. It was the kind of sound that makes the heart leap because you never expect joy to arrive on a cracked ringtone. I fumbled it out, thinking perhaps it was a message from my sister Marge, calling about groceries or some banal thing, and for a second I wanted to hide it, to keep the phone from being another event in the room. But I glanced down at the screen, and the name made my chest expand in a way that felt almost indecent. Michael Jenkins. Michael had been a college classmate. He had the slow laugh of someone secure in himself. He used to draw pencil sketches on the margins of his notebooks and gave me a copy of a poem once that I still have tucked in an old dress. He'd written me once, many years ago, when I had thought my heart had been sewn into its last seam. Life had scattered us, jobs, marriages, the stubborn geography of decades, and I had not expected to hear from him again. The light on the phone blinked. There was a message. "Are you in? Seattle. Call me." For a moment I forgot the argument, the envelopes, the candlelight. My fingers went cold on the device. In the thin space between what I'd been and what someone else had remembered me as, something lifted. It was not grand. It was a possibility. It was a place where I could imagine my life arranged differently, not because I was fleeing, but because something new had offered itself without asking permission. Valerie watched my face like a hawk. Her eyes narrowed. "Who's that?" she asked. "A friend," I said. "An old friend." It sounded like a small thing, but I felt it like an invitation. Valerie's nostrils flared. "And what now? You'll run off to Seattle? After you throw us out of the house? The words were meant to sting. She was trying to tie my name to abandonment, to make the moral calculus hers and pin it on me. I felt the old guilty tug of being accused of turning my back, but then I thought of Charles's laugh at the back of my mind, of the years we'd planned for each other like two people building a bench to rest upon in old age. I thought of the ring in the pawn shop, what we'd given up, what we'd kept, and how foolish it would be to allow guilt to be a jail when the door was open. I looked at Robert. He seemed to shrink further under the watch of his wife's judgment. He looked ready to take whatever armor I might hand him. It occurred to me then how many ways in life you are required to make a choice when the comfortable option is to continue aching in place. I turned the phone back to the screen and read the message again. Call me. Seattle. My smile returned, softer this time, and I said aloud, to the room and to Valerie and to my son, maybe I will call him. For an instant, no one moved. Then Valerie's hand slapped against the back of the chair so hard the wood made a worried sound. You can't be serious, she said again. This is all about you. Maybe it is, I said. Maybe it's about the first time in a very long time I think about what my life could be other than a ledger entry. Robert's eyes filled. He looked at me, not with the youthful naivete of a boy, but with a dawning recognition that perhaps the woman who had held him was herself entitled to hold something. An option, a new address, a life chapter that did not begin or end with his needs. Valerie's face hardened. I saw, for the first time in months, the shape of her fear. She had loved the safety net in its golden frame. She had not loved what pulling it back would teach her husband. This is the hard thing about compassion. Sometimes it smooths things out so long that the person being smoothed forgets how to stand on their own. The candle guttered. The clock kept time. I placed my phone face down on the table and wrapped my hands around the warm rim of my cup. I did not know what I would do. I did not know if calling Michael would be stepping into a romance story or a simple friendship rekindled into companionship. I only knew what I did know. I had set a boundary. I had said no to being a purse for someone else's avoidance. And, for the first time in a long stretch of life, the idea of leaving my front porch of 80 years felt like a possibility instead of a betrayal. If this story is hitting something raw in you, stay with me. There's more to how the night unfolded than who shouted loudest, and what comes next is something none of us expected. We sat in that silence for a while longer. Valerie fumed into her napkin. Robert went to the sink and washed his hands with slow, deliberate motions, as if scrubbing could erase the last 6 months. I felt both trepidation and a strange lightness, the way you feel after dropping a heavy sack you've carried too long. There was sorrow, yes. The end of anything you've kept alive for others has a mournful sound. But there was also something like air moving into a room that had been airtight for too long. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice, somewhere down the block, and the night leaned in closer. The envelopes were still on the table. The words on the back, "This stops in 30 days," stared up at us like a faintly hopeful map. Valerie stood abruptly, scraping her chair back. "We'll talk about this later," she said, voice brittle with the kind of authority she hoped would intimidate. She swept past me to the doorway and paused, not looking back. "You will not be able to keep this secret for long," she said. "People will talk." "I'm not keeping it a secret," I answered. "It's not a secret anymore." She smiled then, but it wasn't a smile for me. It was the smile of someone who knows how to mobilize the neighborhood, to gather allies. It felt small and domestic in a way I found fierce. She left with a click of the door. Robert sat back down. He looked smaller and older, and like someone who had been given a task he hadn't known he needed. "I'll start tonight," he said softly. "You will," I agreed, "and I'll help." He reached across the table as if to hold my hand, but then drew back, embarrassed by the tenderness of the act. He picked up his fork like a man picking up a tool, then set it down again. There was work to be done, calls to make, applications, the indignity of dependence to be transformed into dignity of effort. We finished the pudding. We did not laugh. We did not dwell on the insult as if it had been a play. We only sat, tasting the sweetness that felt oddly like a small mercy. After he left that night, after the polite goodbyes and the soft closing of the door, I sat at the window and looked out at the street. The porch light cast a small halo. The house was quiet in a way that felt both lonely and clean. I remembered the first time Charles and I had walked this street, the way we'd argued over paint colors for the shutters, like it was the most important thing in the world. Life has a way of paring us down to what matters. I had been carved, too, by the chisels of illness and loss and the long apprenticeship of widowhood. But standing there, feeling the small warmth in my chest that had returned after I set my boundary, I felt less carved than renewed. My phone buzzed again. I picked it up and thumbed the screen. Michael had sent a plain message. "Call me when you can. Seattle's waiting." I pressed my finger to the tiny green dot of the call icon and let it sit there. I could hear the house settling, the old pipes sighing, and in that breath I felt the shape of the coming week. There would be phone calls, paperwork, perhaps arguments I could not avoid. There would also be a choice to make, one that did not belong solely to my son or his wife. It belonged to me. The needle of the clock moved. I thought of the ring, the long, patient labor of sewing a hem until it lies smoothly, the times I had given until I had little left for myself. I thought of Michael's laugh in a memory corridor I had not walked down in years. I thought of the envelopes on the table and the words on their backs. I let my hand hover over the call button. Outside, the wind picked up. For the first time in a long time, the night felt full of roads instead of walls. For the first time in a long time, the night felt full of roads instead of walls. I did what I used to do when decisions sat like heavy fabric across my lap. I made a list. Not on paper. My hands know lists by rhythm, but in my head. Phone call to Michael. 30 days written in my mind like a calendar of small, stern boxes. Sit with Robert. Help with resumes, sort through envelopes, and make meals that were not apologies. The practical things that keep life stitched together even when the heart wants to flutter away. I found myself dialing Michael with my thumb still warm from holding the cup. His voice came on like a familiar coat, easy and pleasantly stunned. "Shirley," he said, "I didn't know if you'd answer. Seattle's been good to me, but there's been a vacancy at the little gallery I volunteer at. Thought of you when I ran into an old friend who needed mending hands for costumes. I thought, well, why not ask?" He didn't make it a grand rescue. He made it an offer, a place to breathe, a chance to see ocean tides again. The way he said, "Come for a month," felt like someone offering a spare seat at a table without asking me to beg for it. It was the kindness of an old friend who remembered the person behind the name tag of widow, seamstress, mother. "I'll come," I told him. Not because I was fleeing, but because there was a thread of me that had been waiting for someone else to hand it a needle. We set dates and small plans. He suggested a modest guest room in his little house, a ferry ride to Bainbridge, a walk along the water where the gulls have the swagger of people who got away with living. He sent me a photo of the house framed by cedar trees. It felt like a postcard from a life that had room for me. The next morning, I woke with a softness at the edges. The envelope still lay on the table with the note I had written on the back. The 30 days loomed like someone else's deadline at the top of a ledger, and beneath it, the real work waited, helping my son find his feet without carrying him on my shoulders. Robert was up early. He'd left a note. "I called 2 places. I'll be at the library. We'll look through job listings after lunch." The note trembled slightly at the corner where his hand had pressed harder. He had always tried to be a decent man. He'd been lucky in ways that made him soft. That night had been a rude faucet for him, but I also knew he could become someone who learned to keep water flowing with dignity. We spent the first week making calls together. I held the phone sometimes so he could hear what a steady voice sounded like when someone else read your worth aloud. He applied for positions he never would have considered before: a night custodial role at a hospital, a part-time stocking job at a grocery store, a temporary assignment in a warehouse. There were rejections and silence, an ache I knew too well. There were also small acceptances. The night cleaning job came through first. It paid modestly. It began at midnight, and it meant he would have to learn to live with a schedule that made evenings empty and early mornings full of the honest kind of fatigue. On the 10th day, he had his first real setback. The landlord's office called while we were sitting with a stack of application forms. The notice they'd received 2 weeks earlier had escalated. Final warning. A lien threat document had been slipped under the door. The amount owed was larger than anyone had thought. Panic set in. Night work would not cover that month's back rent fast enough. That night, Robert did what I had once done when fear ate at bone. He started to drink to quiet the noise. I could tell by the way his hands shook when he reached for the glass. I had no right to be surprised. It was, I realized, the pattern I had tried to buy time around. Time he had lived in as a shelter instead of a schoolroom. We argued in small ways. He said, "I can sort this." I said, "You must." He said, "I can't breathe under this shame." I said, "Then breathe through it." There was no sudden triumph speech. There was only the messy, uneven work of staking a place on the ground and refusing to move until your feet remembered they could carry you. 2 nights later, he called me from his car. He'd been locked out. The landlord had sent a tow notice and a final demand while he'd been at a temp interview. He slept in the car that night. I heard it in his voice, the kind of tired that sits in the bones. I drove to the parking lot where he sat wrapped in an old blanket and brought him soup in a thermos. He hadn't eaten. His pride had kept him from using the shelter services I had suggested earlier. "Mom," he said, voice thin in the parked car, "I'm sorry." For a moment I wanted to take the steering wheel and steer the whole life into the safety lane. I wanted to hand him a rolled-up map of adulting and say, "Start here." Instead, I sat beside him on the hood, the car shaking with cold and old airbags, and said the things a mother must say and a parent must mean. You are not defined by this season. You are not beyond repair. He found the night job. He kept it. He started going to a therapist I had found on a community board, someone who worked with sliding scale fees and long appointments. Therapy was not a miracle. It was slow. He missed sessions sometimes. He came once and refused to speak. On other days, he offered up a small, shaky honesty. He did the paperwork for an occupational program that might, if he stayed the course, lead to a stable day job. Progress appeared in small, real ways: a completed application filled without my hand hovering over his, a call he made on his own to an old schoolmate about a possible roofing gig, the way he learned to make oatmeal in the evening for the night shift so he wouldn't arrive hungry. He began to sleep in fits, but his body recalibrated to a different kind of exhaustion, the one that comes from work rather than worry. Valerie watched it all with a face that hardened and softened at odd intervals. She'd moved back into her mother's house 2 weeks after we had that dinner. She put her things into a small car and left with a precision that had been, until that night, one of her strengths. She called the neighbors and let them know her version of events, stories about meddling in-laws and unreasonable parents. They whispered and nodded as neighbors do. Rumors are like loose threads. They flit and catch on new garments. But neighbors' opinions don't pay rent. Time and responsibility do. One cold morning, a few months in, Robert drove me to the social services office so we could go over budget planning. He'd started a community college night class for basic computer skills to help with job prospects. He was slow to speak about his past, about the nights he'd spent drunk and the friends who had offered him a quick fix of cash for errands that left him hungrier later. He spoke more easily about the future because it allowed for reconstruction. "You did the right thing, Mom," he said once while we were folding pamphlets on unemployment benefits. I didn't see it before. I was scared you wanted me to fail. You were afraid of failing, and so was I answered. We have both been afraid. Different seams, same fear. There was a gentleness between us now that had been missing for years, a new language of small responsibilities and honest admissions. At home, the house felt different. I had stopped slipping envelopes into mail slots like a conspirator. I kept smaller accounts for myself, one for cat food, another for new needles. I treated myself to a haircut I hadn't had in years. I found I liked the person who met me in the mirror when I lifted my chin. Independence hadn't flattened me. It had given the hull of my life a chance to be resealed properly. And then came Seattle. Michael met me at the ferry, carrying a floral scarf that didn't match the crisp autumn light. He greeted me with a laugh that felt like it remembered my name before labels did. There was no cloying romance at first, no overstated vowels of desire. There was a man who liked to be near an old friend and showed it in small, steady ways. A hand at the small of my back when we boarded, an umbrella extended with the casual confidence of a person who expects to be useful. The month I spent there was not a montage of whirlwind romance. It was a slow, useful knitting together of two people who had lived full lives and found a new corner to sit in. We walked the esplanade. He taught me to make coffee exactly the way he liked it, a touch of cinnamon and a patience for letting things bloom. I sewed for the theater, mending hems and stitching new linings into old costumes. The work didn't pay much, but the theater's director, a bright woman with dyed hair and a kindness for people like me, provided me a backstage pass to small wonders. The hush before curtains rise, the camaraderie of those who build illusion with their hands. Michael's family welcomed me at a modest dinner where the chairs were a little mismatched and the conversation moved like birds. He had a sister who painted houses in the summertime and a niece who stole my buttons and called me Auntie Shirley with all the confidence of a child given a new game. There were moments there I had not allowed myself to expect, to be part of a family not because I was someone's mother, but because I was someone worth having around. What happened between Michael and me grew in ordinary ways. A shared laugh over a kettle that whistled too loudly, an argument about the best route to Bainbridge that ended in our agreeing he was obstinate and I was right, and quiet evenings in which I realized my hands were not just hands that had mended socks and sewed hems, but hands someone else wanted to hold. There was no hurry. We both had a history that deserved respect and patience. Meanwhile, back home, Robert's life was rebuilding its scaffolding piece by piece. He called more often. Sometimes the calls were short. Sometimes he left messages that were clumsy with apology. He began to pay me back in small ways, replacing a burned-out light bulb, taking out the recycling, bringing me a bouquet of wildflowers from the side of the road when he had a moment's pride to spare. He paid what he could toward the back rent, never the whole amount at once, but enough to show a discipline that had not been there before. Therapy remained a slow work. He learned to name the impulse that made him reach for the bottle. He learned to notice it before the first sip. He learned to be honest about the friends he kept and the ones who kept him honest. He enrolled in a basic electrician's prep class, a practical course with instruction and a room full of men and women who were ready to trade old patterns for hard skills. He was awkward at first on tools, but he had perseverance. Valerie called once 6 months in. Her voice was brittle. "You've changed him," she said, small and sharp. "You made him dependent." "I helped when he needed it," I said, "and then I taught him to stand." There was silence, and somewhere in it was the truth. A house shared without shared values becomes a place to divide rather than a shelter to build. She had chosen a path in which a safety net felt like a right rather than a responsibility. She remarried 2 years later to someone her mother approved of. The outskirts of our lives tugged apart like separate fabrics. I wished her no ill. The way I had learned to wish people well was to let go of bitterness and fold it into understanding. There are some closures you accept with grace, because you know every human is making the best choice they can with the tools they've been given. When I returned from Seattle at the end of that month, Michael met me at the airport with the same calm laugh and a small, sun-faded book of poems he'd picked up on a walk. The life I returned to had a different weight to it than the one I had left. There was a steadier rhythm at home. Robert had a schedule. He had bills to meet, appointments to keep. He cooked dinner sometimes, and I taught him to roll a seam so it would hold. We visited a counselor together, the three of us, because boundaries affect the whole family. We talked without accusation, and Robert spoke up about pride and panic. He told me about sleeping on a friend's couch the week before the night job, about the shame that kept him from calling sooner. He wanted to repair what he'd broken. He didn't expect absolution. He wanted accountability. Part of my problem, he said in that session, looking at me, was I thought love meant someone would always fix my mistakes. I thought you would always be there to pick up the pieces. I wanted to save you, I said. I am sorry for the ways my saving became your crutch. I should have taught you tools earlier, but I'm proud of you for learning now. There were apologies and tears and practical agreements, a budget plan, a savings goal, one small emergency fund established. He set up automatic transfers in the amount he could spare. It was clumsy at first. He overpaid once and then had to ask me to cover food that month, but he kept showing up. Months turned into a year. Small things accrued into shape. He earned a certificate from his course and found a day job doing maintenance for a small condo complex. It was not glamorous, but he came home with his hands tired in the honest way of someone who'd used them. He paid off the largest chunk of the back rent and sent me a note. Thank you for not giving up on me. I know I didn't deserve your help, but I'm trying to earn it back. That note was a new kind of furniture in our home, less a gilded thing than a well-made table, solid and useful. Michael and I continued to talk long distance. He visited in the spring with a suitcase of plants he convinced me I needed on the porch. He fixed a leaky gutter with an efficiency that made me clap in the rain. We decided slowly that what began as a friendship could become more. I had reached an age where the hurry had fallen away. That absence of hurry made room for honest choices. We married 9 months after that first month in Seattle. It was a small ceremony in my backyard, with neighbors who had watched our lives from porches and friends from the theater who applauded in a way reserved for those who had seen us in the quiet. Robert stood beside me at the reception, in a shirt that still had a patch where I sewed it the week before, looking like a man who had done honest work to be present. He gave a toast that made our cheeks wet with laughter and reflection. I used to think strength was never needing help, he said, voice steady. Now I know strength is learning to ask for the right help and learning to stand when it's your turn. There were faces in the crowd I did not expect, and faces I had expected and feared. Valerie, predictably, did not attend. She sent a short message with an image of neutral hands folded on a table. I kept it in my pocket for a day and then set it in a drawer. Some people are not meant to travel the same road as you. That is not a mark of failure, but of different directions. The life with Michael was gentle. He liked quiet rituals, Sunday mornings with old newspapers and new coffee, the way he read the paper aloud to me with a faux broadcaster's voice that made me laugh. We had arguments, not many, but real ones. I admitted, with an honesty I had not given myself before, that I sometimes worried I had lost my sharpness, that the years of being needed had left me uncertain of the person beneath the mother label. Michael listened and never made me feel foolish for admitting it. You're less seamstress, more seam, I told him once, a joke that caught both of us. You've been the thing that holds two edges together. He took my hands and said, So you fix me, and I fix the roof. We'll be very practical together. The months that followed had kind rhythms. We took small trips, weekends at lighthouses, a road trip along the Oregon coast where we ate clam chowder from paper bowls and listened to waves argue with rocks. I sewed for the theater when the season called for mending and found satisfaction in the ritual of turning frayed edges into something sound. Michael encouraged me to teach a community class on sewing basics at the senior center. Watching older women learn to mount a button with patience and a laugh became a new kind of living. Robert came to visit often. He learned slowly to be present without apology. He took on tasks around my house that made me look at him in a new light, changing the aging porch railing, installing sturdier hooks in the shed, taking the slow, careful responsibility to maintain what had been passed down. He dated a woman from his class, someone steady and laughing, and they moved in when both felt ready. It was not dramatic. It was a gentle cohabitation that allowed both to keep their own patterns while adding small, shared routines. We did not close off the truth of the past. There were evening conversations where we revisited the night of the insult, the envelopes, the 30 days. We discussed the cost of our choices, not to lay blame, but to keep understanding clear. I told him how selling the ring had felt like a violent pruning and also a protection. He told me how he had felt small when he admitted he couldn't manage. Those conversations made sense of the map we kept consulting when the weather changed. We had learned how to ask for what we needed without making the other person into a permanent rescuer. People asked me, sometimes with thin curiosity, what I'd learned about boundaries. I would answer honestly, boundaries are a grammar of love. They tell someone how to treat you by what you accept. They are not punishments, they're road signs. People sometimes bristle at that language, as if freedom and boundaries are iron bars. But they are not. For me, the 30 days taught everyone something. It taught Robert that he could break a pattern and build another. It taught me that love must sometimes include tough choices. It taught Valerie that not everyone will live by the same book. Her story ended in a separate chapter. There were days, even years later, when the old shame would surface. Someone would make a thoughtless remark about a mother who spoils her children, and I would feel the old thread tug. Then I would breathe and remind myself that the story we'd lived had been full of complexities. The sold ring, the soup, the envelopes, the hard lesson. We had not been saints. We had been people learning how to be better. Robert's small acts of repair were not erasures of the past, but evidence of work. When I look back now, the house with the painted shutters, the sewing machine with a new belt, the pockets of my life with added smiles, it feels less like a triumph and more like a patient mending. The insult from that night still rings in a darker echo in my memory, but its sting has been rearranged by everything that came after. What Valerie intended as a wound became, instead, a hinge. It opened a different door. If you are sitting with a similar story, if someone has used words as knives while expecting you to keep sewing their life back together, know this: you are allowed to set limits. Setting them may not fix everything. It may not even keep people you love in your life the way they once were. But boundaries can free you to be the person you still might want to become. For me, it meant a second love, a son who learned to stand, and a life that had new adventures tucked into its seams. I do not pretend we had no pain. There were lonely nights, and nights I questioned my choices. There were times when I worried that I had been too late, or too proud, or not brave enough. But those nights were part of the path, not the path itself. The needle kept moving, the hem stitched. When Michael and I stand on the porch in the evening now, the sky a banded gray and gold, I think sometimes of the kitchen table with the 3 envelopes and the candle that burned low. I think of my hands, which once filled envelopes and later held a plane ticket. I think of Robert, who came to understand responsibility not as a punishment, but as a discipline that honors the person he is. We all have our stitches. Some are visible, some are tucked under hems where no one looks. I like to believe that what I did that night, that quiet, firm smile and the note that said, "This stops in 30 days," was not a punishment. It was a last kind mercy disguised as firmness. It was a way of saying, with love and with limits, you must learn to stand on your own 2 feet. I will stand nearby to help you do it. If this story speaks to something in you, if you have carried a secret sacrifice or been on the receiving end of one, I invite you to share what you learned. Tell me how you stitched your life back together or someone else's. If you'd like to hear another story like this, about renewal and small, honest changes, there are more of them. We survive and we change, and sometimes, unexpectedly, we get to be loved for who we've become. Thank you for staying with me.